Yeah, so for a lack of time, I'm going to jump right in and start with what my view is on what orthography is and what my basic assumption is. So my assumption that is underlying this entire talk is that there is normativity, some kind of normativity, in every language that has a written modality, so every written language. And there are different types of how this normativity can manifest itself. There can be officially regulated and codified orthography, such as the one that we have in German, but there can also be other types of orthography, like the one we have in English, which is unofficially codified. Yeah, we will see that later. And my definition of orthography is that, on the one hand, it is a restricted part of a writing system. It is that part that is deemed correct, where we have this sort of category of correctness that distinguishes it from variation or non-standardized writing. There must be some form, I argue, of explicit recording or awareness of this sort of normative part of the writing system in order to speak of orthography. If there is not such an awareness, I speak of a pre-orthographic state of a writing system. I'll get back to that in a second. On the other hand, I think it is also a pragmatic process. So in a dynamic reading, what orthography denotes, in my opinion, is practices of writing correctly, as well as, I think more importantly, meta-pragmatically evaluating not only one's own writing, but also, or more importantly, others' writing as correct, incorrect, more appropriate, less appropriate. And there we have two perspectives of how to view and analyze orthography. On the one hand, we have a structural perspective and a sociolinguistic pragmatic perspective. The goal of my current research is to find out how normativity in the form of such orthographies manifests across writing systems and literate cultures with the help of some descriptive criteria that I will present to you now. The first of the criteria I call origin, and the two sort of categories that are distinguished by it are natural and artificial. The crucial factors here are time and use. So a natural orthography is based on the prior use of the writing system. And what is ported over into an orthography is actually the conventions that users have agreed on implicitly or sometimes explicitly over time. An artificial orthography is not based on prior use. It has been designed and implemented at a specific point in time and does not port over any prior spellings that people have agreed on among themselves. It's important to say that this criterion and many of the other criteria that I will show you does not pertain to an entire orthography, but just parts of it. So an orthography can be natural in some components and artificial, like in German, where many parts are natural. They have been ported over from what has been used before anyway, and some parts are rather artificial as they have been sort of implemented in reforms and are not based on the prior use. These are two example trajectories that I just want to quickly comment on. In the first one, you see sort of a natural development of a writing system. A writing system emerges, is used by users, and what I wrote under it is pre-orthography. This is the emergence of conventions, preferences among users. So users, I think, do develop rather quickly some sort of evaluative thinking, normative thinking about writing and literacy practices. And at some point, there can be a design and implementation of an official orthography. And this is just an example, but if the prior use is codified, then this orthography is natural. And at a given point, and there can be many reforms, not just one, but there can be a reform. And if what is sort of implemented and decided on in the reform is spellings that are not based on prior use, then the orthography can become artificial, even at a later point in time. And the second example trajectory is sort of typical of orthography development, where new writing systems are being created. And mostly when this happens, I would argue it is not only writing systems that are created, but orthographies from the start with sort of a standardization. And in case that this is for a language that has not been written before, then this orthography has to be artificial. There was no prior use of literacy in this language. But as you see with this dotted part of the arrow, with time and use, prolonged time and use, there can be and will be, I think, an internalization. And the explicitly codified external rules are internalized by users, which is how this orthography, again, can become natural. The second criterion that I want to talk about is regulation, and specifically how an orthography is regulated. And in my view, regulation is an active process, so there needs to be some awareness of sort of the norms in a written language, which means that regulation is an important criterion to distinguish pre-orthography from orthography, the way that I'm talking about it now. Important questions here, and I'm going to list a lot of questions that are important to study later. What is the regulatory process? So there can be different kinds of regulatory processes. Is it official? Meaning, is there an official external authority that is in charge officially? There can be different types. There can be ministries, councils, committees. So, and sometimes they are a part of the government, sometimes they're not. Mostly they're comprised of experts. So who are these stakeholders? What are their motivations? What is the public's awareness of this regulation process and the regulators? Are they national or plurinational? In the case of German, we have a central language, a written language, and a plurinational sort of council for German orthography. And also who are unofficial regulators. They're not just official regulators, but the public itself also regulates, and also publishers of dictionaries, for example, who are not officially in charge. Time is also an important factor. How do these regulators work? Do they just work once when an orthography is designed and implemented, or do they work regularly? Do they want to ensure that sort of the public is proficient in an orthography? Do they work on literacy programs? Do they change curricula, etc.? Do they work on later reforms even? Which brings me to the next criterion, which is modification. Does an orthography sort of exist in its original first form in which it has first been implemented, or has it been reformed? What constitutes a reform is an important question here, and I believe that it requires renewed regulatory activity and recodification, which will be the next criterion, codification, so a change in how the rules are written down. As for the scope, we can discuss whether smaller changes and in codification already constitute reforms. In German, in 2017, we had the introduction of a uppercase scharfes S, which was also controversially discussed. But does this one change already count as a reform? So yeah, reforms are very important sort of objects of study. They are, I think, meta-pragmatic, on the one hand, minefields, because people get very emotional about them because their language is being changed in the context of reforms, but they're also for us thus gold mines, because you can study people's attitudes towards reforms, towards sort of the superseded orthography, towards the new one, towards the stakeholders who are in charge. Yeah. And one thought that I just want to share with you is that my initial assumption was that there is always, or rather quickly when writing evolves, this kind of normative thinking. So if every stage of writing is sort of pre-orthographic, does that mean that sort of the first implementation of an orthography is already a sort of reform? So, and you have that in orthography development, where you have so-called legacy orthographies that are being sort of superseded by the official orthography that is brought on mostly by outsiders. Codification is, I think, one of the most important criteria. You have here official codification, such as rule books, guidelines. In German, you have the so-called amtliche Regelungen issued by the Council for German Orthography. But you have also prescriptive dictionaries, such as in Thai, which is officially issued by the Royal Society of Thailand. But mostly, I think dictionaries are unofficial regulations. Like in German too, we do not have an officially codified dictionary, but we have the Duden, for example. And in English, we have the Oxford Dictionary, we have Merriam-Webster. They are not official regulators, but they do somehow unofficially codify English orthography. Also because people ascribe to these sort of unofficial regulators this authority. We have also at a more local level, just two examples, sort of codifications in a looser, broader sense, like in-house rules by some publishing outlets. You had them with the German orthography reform, where certain newspapers had their own rules. And at an even more local level, you could speak of sort of maybe orthographic influencers or trendsetters in online contexts. And we're not talking about orthography in a strict sense now, but when people behave in a certain way, orthographically or graphically, and in a certain group and context, people follow them, then this can be seen sort of as a model function and also as a sort of micro codification, because it is written down. Codified means written down, basically. So this is important. The rules of the orthography have to be written down somewhere. And we will revisit this with a later criterion, but what is important also is to look whether a codification is complete or incomplete. If it is incomplete, it has some blind spots. It does not cover everything of the writing system. So for some parts of the writing system, there actually is no correct or incorrect. So whether you use two commas, for example, for an ellipsis or parentheses, yeah, could just be a matter of style if it's not codified anywhere as correct or incorrect. Another very crucial sociolinguistic criterion is community involvement. What are the actors that are involved? How are they involved? And in many publications on orthography development, this is sort of singled out as the most important criterion. There is, of course, direct and official community involvement, which is typical of orthography development when people actually sit at the table of a community and together with experts decide on what an orthography should look like, or in a reform process also. There is indirect and somewhat official community involvement. I spoke of natural orthographies in which the prior use of a writing system by users is sort of codified. So this is indirect, but still official community involvement when the spellings that users have agreed on are used in the orthography. And then we have indirect and unofficial community involvement, which concerns single individual literacy practices, I would say. So for example, there have been interesting studies on so-called grassroots prescriptivism, and people mostly online in internet contexts sort of curbing each other's writing as correct, incorrect, more or less appropriate in a given context. So an intra-community curbing of how to write correctly. And this interestingly concerns not only sort of grammatic, linguistically functional aspects of the writing system that are usually codified in an orthography, but also material aspects. So also typographic behavior is also sort of judged normatively, as I saw in my own studies. So what fonts are being used, for example, people have very, very harsh sometimes opinions about that, very strong opinions. And what I found out in 21 interviews that I conducted with people about orthography is that people, on the one hand, want to have a say in what an orthography looks like, but on the other hand, the final say should be just for the experts. They fear and oppose orthographic anarchy. So normal people like themselves should not have the final say of what an orthography looks like. But they have problems with defining what experts should be or what experts should know. So then I come to two structural criteria, the first of which is variability. And this refers to the sort of relation between the graphematics of a writing system, sort of all its systematic resources, regularities, and the orthography. And I've worked on this in detail in my publications. I do not have the time to go into that in detail now. But what we see with this criterion is the question of what is the potential for different types of variation. So we have, for example, codified licensed variation. What does that mean? That means that in a dictionary you have, for example, two variants of writing a word, and both of them are correct, and you have to choose. So this is codified licensed variation. You have uncodified licensed variation. I already talked about the blind spots of codifications. When something isn't codified, then you can decide, basically. And this is the case for new words, for example. When new words are introduced, they're not in the dictionary yet, then yeah, basically there are no rules that are codified. And you have unlicensed variation. That is technically orthographically incorrect, so it breaks orthographic rules, but it's still decodable, it's still readable. It is communicatively very relevant because it often or mostly has social meaning, if it is intentional especially, but also if it's unintentional. This criterion affects the perception of what a mistake is in a writing system and in an orthography, specifically the difference between mistakes and variation, because we have a very fine-grained understanding of when a person wanted to not use capitalization because it's intentional and a stylistic choice, and when it's a mistake. So this also curbs the possibility for creativity with or without deviance. And yeah, what I want to say here as well is that even variation and even non-standardized writing is judged by us as, well, with some normative categories. They may not be correct and incorrect because technically for these areas of the writing system, we do not have these tools at our disposal, but still we judge these types of writing as more or less appropriate in a given context, better or worse for a given goal. Yeah. The second structural criterion is linguistic motivation. So are the orthographic rules systematic in that they predictably pick variants from the graphematic solution space? So the space where all the systematically possible variants of writing a word or an utterance are sort of stored. Does the orthography systematically pick these spellings? And there are various principles that can underlie motivation. They do not have to be pure phonographic transparency or pure morphographic transparency. We have other principles like the etymological principle, aesthetic principle. So they have been described mainly with respect to alphabets before. Yeah. What this criterion distinguishes is explainable spellings, which we can derive from rules, and exceptions, which we cannot derive from so-called general rules that have a larger scope and concern sort of a bunch of spellings. And then we have particular rules or singular rules, which actually are just individual dictionary entries. They are exceptions. We cannot derive them from any rules. They are, singular and individual. And it's important to distinguish this criterion from the first one that I showed you, which was origin, natural, artificial, because for several reasons, motivated spellings do not have to be the natural ones. People do not have to settle for the linguistically motivated spelling in what they use. There can be other factors, sociolinguistic factors, psycholinguistic factors. So, and this is also sort of the conflict in orthography development very often when linguists want to impose a very systematic spelling, but the people actually do not accept these spellings. I'm arriving at the final criterion or a result of all the other criteria, which is the ascribed status of an orthography. The question of how important an orthography is in a literate community, especially to users. This also determines, I think, the existence and severity of sanctions that can follow sort of deviance from the rules. It also influences sort of the awareness of an interest for orthography and for sort of topics such as emojis and whether they lead to a decay of writing or language in general. And because I'm running out of time, I am jumping to my conclusion, which is, and it's a shame that I didn't have more time to talk about this, but due to a descriptive reading in the dominant Anglophone sort of realm, this prescriptive reading of orthography is, I think, still understudied. And however, I think that it is vital to complement sort of graphematic analysis of the inner functioning of writing systems also with an analysis of these normative components. Because while graphematics is interesting for us as grapholinguists, it is invisible to users. What is visible to users is sort of this writing, correct writing, incorrect writing, that they see through this normative lens. Mostly when people learn to write, they learn to write correctly from the start in school, not just to write any way they want to. So orthography is a curbing tool and mechanism. With curbing, not only in a negative sense, it also has its functions and benefits, of course, but it does curb. And yeah, this is how the different criteria come into play here. And now for the next step, of course, it would be interesting to see how with these criteria we can actually describe different kinds of orthographies and compare them to sort of capture the normative situations in different literate cultures. And a next step that I will be taking is actually studying their interaction to see specific orthographies, how do these sort of criteria come into play and how do they interact. Yeah, these are my references, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have time only for 2 questions. I have one question already from online. Is a question by Arvind Iyengar. Or maybe Arvind, maybe you can ask it on Zoom.
Yes, happy to. Great talk, Dimitrios, as I suppose we've come to expect from you. I had a question regarding writing systems, or the written forms of minority languages that lack socio-political power and which have only a small number of users, which sort of stand in contrast to the kind of languages you've just spoken about, like German and so on. How would you categorize these kinds of writing systems, many of which do not undergo any noticeable process of regulation or codification? So do they remain in the pre-orthography stage, or are they, purely graphematic? Are they like a bare graphematic system?
Thank you for this question. Yeah, it's an important question, and I haven't worked that much on minority languages up until this point, but I think definitely that, or maybe there are other cases, and it would be fascinating to see them, of purely graphematic writing, but I do think that there is always some sort of, like I said, normative thinking involved. And the question is also nowadays with sort of globalization, and I don't know how sort of connected these communities are with other communities, where they can sort of import also this idea of this regulation, and how among themselves, even without the existence of any sort of external official linguistic policy, they sort of curb themselves and judge their own writing as correct or incorrect. Right now, I would say that I think it's sort of pre-orthography, but I do not rule out the possibility that there can be orthography even without sort of official codification. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. Our last question by the audience. Yes.
Yeah, in German sociolinguistics, there is a frequent distinction between the role of language experts and the role of language professionals. Mm-hmm. Did you find it some importance in the question of coding of orthography?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part.
Did you find it has some importance in the question of coding of orthography, or for the orientation of people? Mm-hmm. Which one of these categories they think have more power to decide?
Mm-hmm. I think sort of with the people that I interviewed, there is no fine-grained distinction between sort of experts and professionals.
Just experts.
Yeah, they're just experts. It's just one big group of people who, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dimitrios.
Thank you.